What happens when unimaginable wealth meets invisible service? In the hushed, velvet-draped dining room of one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, a deal worth billions was on the verge of being sealed. At the head of the table sat Amelia Tanaka Hayes, the heir to a global empire, yet she was a ghost at her own meeting. She was being ignored, dismissed, and treated as nothing more than a silent figurehead. But the men across from her, titans of industry blinded by their own arrogance, were overlooking one crucial person, the waitress. They saw her as just another part of the furniture. But she was about to change everything with a few quiet words in a language they couldn't understand. The air inside Ethelard wasn't merely conditioned. It was meticulously curated. It carried the scent of old money and quiet, ruthless power. Heavy damask curtains, the color of dried blood, swallowed the sounds of the Manhattan streets outside, creating a tomb-like silence broken only by the discreet clink of silver on porcelain and the murmur of conversations that held significant consequences. This was a place where fortunes were made and dismantled over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of eye-wateringly expensive Bordeaux. Tonight, Table 7, the most secluded alcove with a commanding view of the restaurant's private garden, was the stage for one such dismantling. Amelia Amy Tanaka Hayes felt the oppressive silence like a physical weight. On paper, she was the most powerful person at the table. As the sole heir to Tanaka Corp., a Japanese technology and arts conglomerate founded by her grandfather, her signature was the final, non-negotiable step in a merger that would create a transatlantic behemoth. In reality, she was merely an ornament, a beautifully dressed, impeccably mannered ghost. Across the starched white linen sat the architects of the deal, the American contingent from Sterling Whitmore. At the head was Richard Sterling, a man seemingly carved from granite and cynicism. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and his expression was one of perpetual mild disapproval. He hadn't addressed a single word directly to Amy since they'd sat down an hour ago. To his right was his son, Caleb. Caleb was a sleeker, more modern version of his father, all sharp Italian suit and predatory smile. He exuded an aggressive, dismissive energy, repeatedly directing questions about Tanaka Corp's financials to his own team, as if Amy weren't even present. He would occasionally flick his gaze toward her, a gaze that lingered for a moment too long, assessing her not as a business partner, but as an exotic curiosity. And then there was Melline Vance, Sterling Whitmore's chief legal counsel, a woman with a razor-sharp bob and a mind to match. She spoke in crisp, emotionless clauses, her focus entirely on the sheaf of documents resting beside her plate. To her, Amy was simply the final X on a dotted line they had arranged for her to sign. "The lady will have the Dover sole," Richard had announced to the waiter without a glance in her direction. Amy, who despised fish, had simply inclined her head with a small, tight smile. It was the smile she had perfected over years of being the half-Japanese, half-American bridge between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. Her American father had taught her to be assertive. Her Japanese mother had taught her the art of graceful silence. Tonight, the silence was winning. Her father was sick, very sick. That was the unspoken truth driving this entire merger. With her father, the charismatic force who had bridged the company's Japanese roots with Western markets, now incapacitated by a stroke, the board had panicked. They saw the Sterling Whitmore offer not as a partnership, but as a lifeboat. Amy saw it as a capitulation, a slow erosion of her grandfather's legacy. But her protests had been brushed aside as youthful sentimentality. Her one condition, a seat at this final dinner, was granted as a patronizing concession. "Of course, Amelia, your presence is vital," they had said. Vital, it seemed, only in the most literal physical sense. Observing this silent, brutal ballet from the periphery was Clara. Clara moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and aching feet. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a crisp white apron, was immaculate, but her face, when she thought no one was looking, was etched with a weariness that went beyond her shift. For 5 years, Clara had been a waitress at Ethelgard. She was, in the parlance of the staff, a lifer. She was invisible, and she had learned to use that invisibility as a shield and a lens. She could read tables like a scholar reads a forgotten text. She saw the subtle tension in Amy's shoulders, the way she perfectly arranged her silverware, her fingers never still. She saw the blatant dismissiveness in Caleb's posture as he leaned in to speak to his father, effectively creating a physical barrier between them and the air. She saw the cold finality in Meline's eyes. Clara had served dictators, disgraced politicians, and tech billionaires. She knew arrogance. She knew power. And she knew cruelty when she saw it, especially the quiet, polite kind that suffocated you in a room full of people. Clara felt a strange, protective pang for the young woman at table 7. There was a profound loneliness about her, a fragility hidden beneath the couture dress and the perfectly placid expression. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the bars were closing in. As Clara approached to refill the water glasses, Caleb was laughing at something his father had said. The old guard in Tokyo just doesn't grasp the realities of a 21st century market. They're still operating on honor and handshakes. Richard Sterling grunted in agreement. Honor doesn't show up on a balance sheet. We'll streamline their sentimental assets. The art collection, the cultural grants, a fire sale waiting to happen. Amy's back went rigid. Her knuckles resting on the table turned white. She opened her mouth to speak, her lips forming a silent syllable, but Meline Vance cut her off, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the documents. Speaking of assets, Richard, the clause regarding the Tanaka Foundation is still vaguely worded. We need to ensure we have full discretionary control post-acquisition. They were talking about her grandfather's life's work as if it were office furniture to be liquidated. The blood drained from Amy's face. She felt a wave of dizziness. The curated air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached for her water glass. And in that moment of profound isolation, her fingers faltered. The heavy crystal goblet slipped, tipping over and crashing onto her plate with a sharp crack that shattered the restaurant's hushed reverence. Water and shards of glass spread across the pristine white cloth. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Every eye in the room turned to their table. Then Caleb Sterling let out a short, derisive laugh. "A bit clumsy, aren't we?" he drawled, dabbing at a stray drop of water on his sleeve with a napkin. "Don't worry, I'm sure Daddy's company can afford the damages." The humiliation was a physical blow. It was hot, sharp, and total. Amy stared at the mess, her vision blurring. All the poise, all the training, all the carefully constructed walls crumbled. Under her breath, in a voice so low it was almost a thought, she whispered a single desperate phrase in the language of her mother, the language of her heart, a phrase of pure despair. "Madame de wa, watashi, it's no use. I can't do this." No one at the table understood. To them, it was just a meaningless foreign sound, a sign of her losing her composure. But someone else did. Clara, who had already been moving forward with a fresh napkin and a quiet grace, froze for a fraction of a second. Her eyes met Amy's, and for the first time that night, someone truly saw her. Leaning in close, ostensibly to clear the broken glass, Clara's voice was a soft, steady murmur directly in Amy's ear. Her tone was formal, yet impossibly kind, and her Japanese was flawless, imbued with a Kyoto accent so pure and refined it was like music. "Are you all right, my lady? You are not alone." The world stopped. The effect of Clara's words was instantaneous and profound. For Amy, it was like a drowning person suddenly finding a hand to hold in the dark, churning water. The Japanese words, spoken with such unexpected fluency and empathy, bypassed the cold logic of the business deal and went straight to her heart. "My lady," a term of respect so archaic and formal it was almost courtly. In that moment it wasn't patronizing. It was a validation. It was recognition. Amy's head snapped up, her wide, shocked eyes, glistening with unshed tears, locked onto Clara's. The waitress's face was serene, professional. Yet her eyes held a depth of understanding that was utterly startling. The world, which had been a cacophony of condescension and dismissal, narrowed to this single, unbelievable point of connection. The men at the table, however, experienced a different kind of shock. Their bubble of linguistic superiority had been popped by the one person they were conditioned to ignore completely. Richard Sterling's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared at Clara, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had heard the sounds, recognized them as Japanese, but for them to have come from their waitress was a confounding impossibility. It was like a piece of the scenery had suddenly spoken. Caleb's smug smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. He looked from Clara to Amy and back again, his brain struggling to process the scene. The power dynamic, so carefully established in his favor, had just been inexplicably disrupted. Melanie Vance was the first to recover, her legal mind instantly analyzing the new variable. She set down her pen, her gaze on Clara now sharp and appraising. "What did you just say?" she asked, her tone clipped and demanding. Clara didn't look at her. Her focus remained entirely on Amy. With practiced efficiency, she began to gather the larger shards of the broken glass with a napkin-covered hand, her movements calm and deliberate. "I merely asked the lady if she was all right," Clara replied in perfect unaccented English, her voice returning to the deferential tone of a professional server. The contrast was jarring, but Amy wasn't letting the moment go. She had found an anchor, and she was clinging to it. She answered Clara, her voice still trembling, but gaining strength in Japanese. "I am all right. Thank you. You surprised me." Clara offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, continuing her work. "It is good to see your spirit is not broken. They are testing you." Caleb, agitated by the exchange he couldn't understand, slammed his hand lightly on the table. "Hey, what's going on here? What are you two talking about?" Richard Sterling held up a hand, silencing his son. His curiosity had now fully eclipsed his irritation. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a functionary, but as a person. The uniform, the apron, the weary lines around her eyes, they were all still there, but now they were overlaid with a layer of mystery. "You speak Japanese?" he stated, the words an accusation and a question in one. "I do, sir," Clara said, finally straightening up, a small pile of broken glass held discreetly in her napkin. "How?" Richard pressed. "Where did you learn?" A new waiter, alerted by the commotion, was hovering nearby, ready to reset the table. Clara gave him a brief nod, and he began his work as she answered. "I studied, sir, a long time ago." Her answer was simple, factual, and utterly unsatisfying to the titans of industry. It was the brevity of it, the lack of any fawning explanation, that unsettled them. She wasn't trying to impress them. She wasn't leveraging her skill for a better tip. She was simply stating a fact. Amy watched this exchange, a flicker of something new kindling within her. For the past hour, she had been a passive object. Now, an unexpected and unknown ally had emerged from the shadows. The dynamic of the room had fractured. She decided to push the crack wider. Turning to Richard Sterling, Amy spoke in English, but her voice was different. The hesitant, deferential tone was gone. In its place was a cool, clear confidence. "Mr. Sterling," she began, and all three of them turned to her, their full attention on her for the first time all evening. "Perhaps your son is right. Perhaps the old guard in Tokyo does operate on principles you find outdated. Principles like respect." She let the word hang in the air. "My grandfather, Keo Tanaka, built his company on the belief that you do not truly know a partner until you understand their heart. And you cannot understand their heart if you do not respect their language or their culture." She paused, then delivered the final pointed blow. "He believed the true strength was not in shouting the loudest, but in listening the most carefully." Caleb flushed a deep, angry red. Melanie's lips thinned into a bloodless line. Richard Sterling, however, simply stared at Amy, his expression unreadable. He had been challenged directly and unequivocally. The ghost had found her voice. He then did something unexpected. He turned his gaze back to Clara, who was now standing respectfully by the service station. "Waitress," he called out, his voice resonating through the dining room. "Come here." Clara walked back to the table, her expression neutral. Miss Tanaka Hayes, Richard said, his eyes still on Clara, seems to be suggesting we've had a failure in communication. A cultural misunderstanding, perhaps. The sarcasm was light, but it was there. You seem to understand her world. From now on, you will remain here. You will facilitate, translate if necessary. It was a preposterous command. A waitress pulled from her duties to act as a corporate interpreter in a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. It was also a power play, an attempt by Richard to reassert control, to turn Clara's unexpected skill into a tool for his own use, to reduce her back to a mere functionary, albeit a more interesting one. Clara's manager, a perpetually stressed man named Julian, hurried over, his face pale with alarm. Mr. Sterling, I do apologize, but Clara has other tables. I will cover her entire night's wages and tips. Double it, Richard snapped, not even bothering to look at him. She works for me now. Do you have a problem with that? He asked, his voice low and dangerous, directed at Clara. For the first time, a flicker of something, defiance, amusement, crossed Clara's face. She looked at Amy, who gave the slightest, almost invisible nod of encouragement. In that silent exchange, an alliance was forged. No, sir, Clara said, her voice perfectly even. I do not have a problem with that. Where shall we begin? The shift was as immediate as it was surreal. One moment Clara was a server. The next she was a central figure in a high-stakes corporate drama. Julian, the manager, scurried away, wringing his hands, but not daring to argue with a patron who spent more on wine in a month than he earned in a year. Clara didn't sit. She stood a few feet behind Amy's chair, a silent, observant sentinel. Richard Sterling clearly intended for her to be a human dictionary, a tool to be picked up and discarded, but both Clara and Amy had other ideas. All right, Richard began, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. He looked at Amy. Let's talk about the Tanaka Art Foundation. Our analysts project its liquidation value at approximately $200 million. A respectable sum, but it's a dead asset. Our plan is to divest and reinvest the capital into R&D. Before Amy could respond, he added, explain that to her, with a nod toward Clara, as if Amy herself couldn't possibly grasp the concept. It was a deliberate, petty jab meant to put her back in her place. Clara stepped forward slightly. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice calm and measured. Miss Tanaka Hayes understands English perfectly. Perhaps the issue is not one of language, but of context. Meline Vance scoffed. Context? Is a simple balance sheet calculation. The asset is underperforming. With respect, ma'am, Clara continued, her gaze unwavering. You are referring to a collection that includes 3 scrolls from the Kamakura period believed to be the only surviving works of the monk Kenshin. You are referring to a collection of Edo period ceramics that redefined the art of kintsugi. You call it a dead asset. The Japanese Ministry of Culture calls it a national treasure. Silence. Richard Sterling's eyes narrowed. Caleb looked confused. It was Meline who recovered first. An impressive recitation, she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Did you learn that from a tour guide brochure? I learned it while writing my doctoral dissertation on the secularization of Buddhist art during the Ashikaga shogunate. Clara replied without a trace of arrogance. My focus was on the very school of artists that Keo Tanaka, Miss Tanaka Hayes' grandfather, spent his life championing and collecting. The air went out of the room. A waitress, a doctoral dissertation. The pieces didn't fit in their ordered, hierarchical world. Caleb let out an incredulous laugh. You're a what? A doctor of art and you're serving sea-base? Life is full of unexpected turns. Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her expression unreadable. Amy seized the opening Clara had created. The foundation is not an asset, she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. It is the soul of my company. It is the embodiment of my grandfather's philosophy. The technology is a tool, but art is what gives it purpose. To liquidate it would be to tell the world that we value profit more than our own identity. It is not for sale. It is not negotiable. Richard Sterling studied her. Then Clara, then back to Amy. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on finding their leverage points. He had assumed Amy's was her youth and inexperience. He had assumed Clara didn't exist. He had been wrong on both counts. "This is sentimental nonsense," Caleb muttered, looking to his father for support. "It's business." "Perhaps," Richard said slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Or perhaps we've been reading the wrong prospectus." He turned his full attention to Amy. "Your father, Robert," he agreed to the terms. He understood the need for this. This was the painful truth. Her American father, a pragmatist to his core, had been worn down by the board and his illness. He had seen the deal as the only way to secure the company's future. "My father is unwell," Amy said, her voice softening with pain. "He was pressured. But he made me promise to be here tonight. He told me to protect the heart. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I heard you talk about selling it off for parts." She then turned slightly in her chair, looking up at Clara. She switched back to Japanese, her voice now carrying a note of genuine inquiry. "Tell me, what do you know of the crane and moon pin?" She gestured to a small, exquisite pin on the lapel of her blazer. It was a delicate, abstract design of a crane in flight against a circle of mother-of-pearl. To the Sterlings, it was a pretty piece of jewelry. Clara's professional demeanor melted away for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of pure academic reverence. She took a step closer, her eyes wide. Is that an original Ko Tanaka?" She breathed in Japanese. "It is the first piece he ever made," Amy replied. "He made it for my grandmother. He said it represented a choice. The crane can fly to the moon, a place of cold, lonely ambition, or it can stay in the reeds, a place of warmth and community. He said, a successful life is about learning to fly between the two." Clara stared at the pin, her expression one of awe. The crane and moon. It was his guiding principle. As a foundational piece of modern Japanese metalwork. "I have only ever seen it in photographs. I wrote a chapter about it." The conversation, fluid and meaningful, was a wall the Sterling Whitmore team could not penetrate. They were outsiders now, listening to a language they didn't know, discussing a philosophy they couldn't grasp. The isolation Amy had felt for the entire evening had been transferred in its entirety to them. Caleb's face was a mask of frustration. "What is she saying? What's so important about a pin?" he demanded. Clara turned back to them, her composure regained. She was no longer just a translator of words. She was a curator of meanings. "Miss Tanaka Hayes was explaining the philosophy behind that piece of jewelry," she said in English. "It is the foundational ethos of the Tanaka Corporation, a balance between ambition and community, between profit and purpose, a concept you might translate as corporate soul." She looked directly at Richard Sterling. "She is telling you that by liquidating the foundation, you are not just selling off assets. You are choosing the moon, and you are asking her to abandon the reeds forever. It is something she will not do." Richard Sterling was silent for a long time. The clatter of the restaurant, the murmur of other conversations, it all faded away. He was looking at his son, then at Madeline, and finally at Amy. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the heir to Tanaka Corp. He was looking at Ko Tanaka's granddaughter, and he was beginning to understand that the quiet, polite woman he had dismissed an hour ago was, in her own way, made of the same granite as he was. The deal he thought was a done deal was suddenly, inexplicably falling apart, and it was all because he had overlooked the waitress. The atmosphere at Table 7 had transformed from a corporate execution into a tense intellectual standoff. The main courses arrived, but no one paid them much attention. The Dover sole sat untouched in front of Amy. The bloody steaks before the Sterlings grew cold. Richard Sterling, a man unaccustomed to being outmaneuvered, especially by those he considered his lessers, took a different tack. He decided to dissect the anomaly, his gaze fixed on Clara, sharp and penetrating. "So, doctor," he began, the honorific dripping with a mix of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. "You have a PhD in Japanese art history, and you work here at Ethelgard. Forgive my bluntness, but the two career paths don't seem to intersect." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "As I said, Mr. Sterling, life has its turns. The academic world is not always a meritocracy. She paused, a flicker of old pain in her eyes. I was on a tenure track at Columbia. I had a grant to curate a major exhibition of post-war Japanese industrial art. My research was unconventional. It challenged the established narrative set by the head of my department, a man named Professor Alistair Finch. At the mention of the name, Melline Vance, who had been quietly observing, looked up from her notes, her eyes narrowing. Alistair Finch, the head of the East Asian Arts Department? He's on the board of the Metropolitan Museum, a true giant in his field. There was a bitter edge to Clarara's voice as she agreed. And he certainly didn't appreciate a junior academic, a woman no less, proving that his seminal work on the period was based on a fundamental mistranslation of Kato Tanaka's own journals. He accused me of academic fraud, of falsifying my sources. There was a hearing. It was my word against his reputation against my nothing. I was exonerated officially, but the damage was done. My funding was pulled. The exhibition was cancelled. My name was blacklisted. No university would touch me. She delivered the story not with self-pity, but with a stark, factual clarity that made it all the more devastating. It was the story of a brilliant career, a life's passion, destroyed by the ego of a powerful man. So I took a job where I could be invisible. She finished with a wry glance around the opulent dining room, and I waited. Amy was staring at Clarara, her heart aching with a shared sense of injustice. She, too, had been dismissed and underestimated by powerful men who saw her as a threat or an inconvenience. Professor Finch, Amy said softly. He approached my father last year, offering to authenticate and appraise our collection for a nominal fee. Melline Vance's pen clattered onto her plate. She looked at Richard, her professional composure finally cracking. Richard, Alistair Finch is our consultant. He's the one who prepared the valuation report on the Tanaka Foundation. He's the one who labeled the assets as non-essential cultural ephemera and recommended their immediate liquidation. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. It wasn't just a business decision. It was a personal vendetta. Finch, unable to destroy Clarara's research, had decided to destroy the subject of it. He was using Sterling Whitmore as a wrecking ball to erase the legacy of Kato Tanaka, and by extension the academic work that had threatened his own. The $200 million valuation wasn't an objective assessment. It was a fabrication born of spite. Caleb looked utterly lost. So what? Our entire financial strategy for this merger is based on some dusty professor's personal grudge? It would appear so, Richard said, his voice dangerously calm. He looked at Melline. Is this true? I didn't know the backstory, Melline stammered, flustered for the first time. He came highly recommended. His valuation was co-signed by 2 other experts. Experts who were likely his former students and loyalists, Clarara interjected quietly. Fincher's influence runs deep. Richard Sterling leaned back, the color draining from his face. He had been played. His firm, his reputation, his meticulously crafted deal all had been compromised because they had relied on a compromised expert. They had walked into a trap, not of Amy's making, but of their own arrogant oversight. They had seen the Tanaka Foundation as a column of numbers on a page, never bothering to question the motives of the man who wrote them. They had failed in their due diligence because of cultural and intellectual laziness. Amy felt a surge of adrenaline. The tables had not just turned. They had been completely overturned. She was no longer the defendant in this negotiation. She was the judge. Mr. Sterling, Amy said, her voice now possessing the cool, commanding tone she had so often heard in her father's voice. It seems your information is flawed. The foundation is not a liability to be jettisoned. It is the core of our brand identity. Its value isn't in its liquidation price. It's in its cultural capital, a concept your consultant conveniently failed to mention. She then looked to Clarara, a silent question in her eyes. Clarara understood immediately. She stepped forward, no longer a waitress or even a translator, but an expert witness reclaiming her stolen authority. The Tanaka Foundation sponsors the most prestigious Young Artists Award in Japan. Clara began, her voice filled with the passion she had suppressed for years. It funds university programs in design and aesthetics. It single-handedly keeps 3 traditional craft workshops in business. The goodwill and brand loyalty this generates is worth exponentially more than a one-time cash injection from a fire sale. To destroy it would be corporate suicide. Your R&D would develop new products, but your customers, the ones loyal to the Tanaka name, would abandon you in droves. You wouldn't just be buying a company. You'd be buying a hollowed-out shell with a tarnished reputation. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, dismantling the entire premise of the Sterling Whitmore strategy. Richard Sterling, a man who prided himself on seeing every angle, sat in stunned silence, realizing he had only been shown one deliberately distorted corner of the picture. He had been so focused on the financial mechanics that he had completely missed the human element, the very soul of the company he was trying to acquire. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of this revelation. The deal wasn't just in jeopardy. The very foundation it was built on had been revealed to be a lie. And the woman who held all the power now was not the slick lawyer or the granite-faced CEO. It was the heiress he had ignored, aided by the waitress he had never even seen. The illusion of control had shattered. Richard Sterling, for the first time in perhaps decades, was at a loss. He had built an empire on meticulous planning and ruthless execution, and in the space of 30 minutes, a waitress had exposed his billion-dollar plan as a house of cards built on the petty vengeance of a disgraced academic. He looked at his son Caleb, who was staring into his cold steak as if searching for answers in the congealing fat. He saw confusion and the dawning, humiliating realization of his own shallow judgment. He looked at Melanie Vance, his brilliant, unflappable lawyer, who was now shuffling her papers with an uncharacteristic uncertainty. Her legal armor had been pierced by a truth that no contract could counter. Finally, his gaze rested on Amy. The timid, silent girl from an hour ago was gone. In her place was a woman who looked every bit the heir to the Tanaka legacy. Poised, intelligent, and in complete command. The power had not just shifted to her side of the table. She owned the entire room. It was Amy who broke the silence. "I believe," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "that we have been operating under a false premise. This dinner is over." She placed her napkin neatly on the table beside her untouched plate. It was a gesture of finality. But she continued as Melanie and Caleb began to show signs of panicked protest. "My flight back to Tokyo isn't until tomorrow afternoon. This presents an opportunity." Richard Sterling leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "An opportunity for what?" "An opportunity for a new deal," Amy stated. "A real one, not an acquisition. Not a takeover. A partnership, one based on mutual respect and a true understanding of what Tanaka Corporation is." She then turned her head to look at Clara, who stood by, a silent but potent presence. "And my first condition for any new negotiation is this." Miss Amy paused, realizing she didn't even know her name. "Doors," Clara supplied quietly. "Clara Doors. Ms. Doors will be on my team," Amy finished, "as my chief cultural advisor. Her academic credentials, which were so unjustly stripped from her, will be publicly reinstated and funded by a new joint initiative between our companies to promote ethical cultural exchange. Professor Finch's fraudulent report will be exposed, and Ms. Doors will be given the resources to finally curate the exhibition she planned." It was an audacious, breathtaking series of demands. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about restoration, it was about justice. Amy was not just saving her grandfather's legacy. She was resurrecting Clara's composure, which had held firm through insults and revelations, finally wavered. Her eyes widened, and she stared at Amy in stunned disbelief. A job, her reputation back, her life's work returned to her. It was more than she had allowed herself to dream of in 5 long years of serving meals to people who never saw her. Caleb scoffed, the sound harsh in the tense quiet. "This is insane. We can't base a multi-billion-dollar merger on hiring the waitress." "Then there is no merger," Amy replied instantly, her tone like ice. There is no deal. You can walk away and explain to your shareholders that you lost the biggest international partnership in your company's history because you took the advice of a fraudulent consultant and were too proud to admit your mistake, or you can stay, and we can build something of actual, lasting value. The choice was stark. Humiliation and failure, or a new path forward dictated by the very people they had dismissed. Richard Sterling was silent for a full minute. He stared at the crane and moon pin on Amy's lapel. He thought about the story Clara had told. Ambition or community, the moon or the reeds. For his entire life he had chased the moon. He had built a cold, vast, and lonely empire. He looked at his son, who embodied that unrelenting, hollow ambition, and then he looked at Amy and Clara. He saw a partnership forged not in a boardroom, but in a moment of shared humanity. He saw a strength there that his company, for all its wealth and power, sorely lacked. He saw the reeds. Slowly, deliberately, Richard Sterling extended his hand across the table to Amy. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice raspy with an emotion he rarely showed. "My office, 10 o'clock. We will start again from the beginning." He then turned his head, his gaze meeting Clara's. He offered her a nod, no longer that of a patron to a servant, but that of one professional to another, a nod of profound, hard-won respect. "Miss Dawes, I expect to see you there." Amy took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "We'll be there." The handshake sealed not the end of a deal, but the beginning of an entirely new one. As the Sterling Whitmore team gathered their things, their earlier swagger replaced by a chastened sobriety, Amy remained seated. After they had gone, leaving a wake of stunned silence, the dining room felt vast and quiet. Amy turned to Clara, who was still standing by the chair, looking as if she were caught between worlds. "Clara-san," Amy said, her use of the respectful Japanese honorific both natural and deeply meaningful. "Is what I proposed, is that something you would want?" Clara looked at her hands, the hands that had carried thousands of plates, cleared away countless messes, hands that were calloused and tired. Then she looked at Amy, her eyes shining with an almost painful brilliance. "For 5 years," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have been a ghost. I studied and wrote about beautiful things, about legacies and art that lasts for centuries, and I lived a life where I was forgotten the moment I walked away from a table. What you are offering me is not just a job. You are offering to let me be seen again." She took a deep breath, standing up straighter, the years of weariness seeming to fall away from her shoulders. "Yes, Miss Tanaka-Hayes, it is what I want, more than you can ever know." Amy smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Please," she said, "call me Amy." In the hallowed, silent halls of Ethelgard, surrounded by the trappings of a world that had tried to render them both invisible, 2 women, an heiress and a waitress, had just rewritten their own futures. The most important deal of the night was not the one between 2 corporations. It was the one forged between 2 souls who had recognized the truth in each other when no one else was bothering to look. The following morning, the sleek, minimalist lobby of Sterling Whitmore Tower felt like a different universe from the cloistered opulence of Ethelgard. Here, the currency was not old-world tradition, but brutal, forward-facing efficiency. Glass, steel, and screens displaying surging stock tickers were everywhere. Amy Tanaka-Hayes walked through the lobby, and this time she was not alone. Beside her, Clara Dawes moved with a quiet composure that belied the seismic shift that had occurred in her life less than 12 hours prior. She was no longer in her server's uniform. At Amy's insistence, a personal shopper had been dispatched at dawn to one of the city's most exclusive boutiques. Clara was now dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, a silk shell underneath. The clothes didn't change who she was, but they were a uniform for a new kind of battle, an armor that allowed others to see the professional she had always been. Their arrival caused a minor stir. The receptionist, who had been expecting only Ms. Tanaka-Hayes, looked at Clara with polite confusion. "Amelia Tanaka-Hayes and Clara Dawes for Richard Sterling," Amy announced, her voice leaving no room for questions. As they were escorted to the elevator, Amy glanced at Clara. Are you ready? Clara gave a small, determined nod. I've been preparing for a meeting like this my whole life, Amy. I just never thought it would happen. The elevator ascended in silence, a rising glass box that revealed the sprawling, indifferent city below. For Clara, it was a potent metaphor. For years, she had been at street level looking up. Now she was rising. The top floor was an exercise in corporate power. The doors opened onto a vast office with a panoramic view of Central Park. Richard Sterling stood waiting for them, not behind his massive desk, but by the window. He was alone. "Good morning," he said, his tone formal, but lacking the dismissive edge of the previous night. "Coffee?" The negotiations that followed were unlike any either side had ever experienced. There was no army of junior associates, no endless slide decks. It was just the three of them, Richard, Amy, and Clara, in that cavernous office. Caleb and Meline, Richard explained curtly, had been reassigned to review our internal vetting processes. It was a polite way of saying they were in the doghouse. Richard Sterling began with an apology. It was not effusive or emotional, but it was genuine. "We acted on poor intelligence and with a profound lack of cultural respect. My firm was arrogant. I was arrogant. That is an error we will now correct." This admission cleared the air, paving the way for something constructive. Amy, with Clara often adding critical details, began to paint a true picture of Tanaka Corporation. She didn't talk about quarterly earnings or profit margins. She spoke of her grandfather's vision. She explained how their investment in a robotics firm was inspired by the intricate puppetry of Bunraku theater, how their user interface design was based on the principles of Japanese garden architecture. Harmony, balance, and revealing beauty slowly. Clara, in turn, provided the academic and historical framework. She laid out, with devastating precision, the flaws in Alistair Finch's report, cross-referencing it with her own research. She produced digital copies of Kato Tanaka's journals on a tablet, showing Richard the very passages Finch had mistranslated to suit his narrative. She quantified the concept of cultural capital, showing him market data from brands that had successfully integrated their heritage into their identity versus those that had abandoned it and failed. Richard Sterling, a man who dealt in numbers, listened with rapt attention. Clara and Amy were giving him a different kind of number, a different kind of value. They were teaching him a new corporate language. "The foundation is not a separate entity," Amy explained, leaning forward. "It's our wellspring. It is our R&D, just a different kind. It is where our engineers and designers go to be inspired. Selling it would be like a farmer selling his well for a one-time payment. You have water for a day and a desert for a lifetime. By lunchtime, the old deal was dead. In its place, the skeleton of a new one was taking shape. It was a true merger of equals. Sterling Whitmore would provide the capital and the access to Western markets. Tanaka Corporation would provide the innovation, the design philosophy, and the long-term vision. The Tanaka Art Foundation would not be touched. Instead, it would be expanded with a new wing established in New York, to be curated and directed by one Dr. Clara Dors. Richard proposed a joint board with Amy taking a position as co-chair. He wanted her vision, her connection to that legacy. He had seen a glimpse of it the night before, and he now realized it was the most valuable asset of all. As they were finalizing the major points, Amy paused. "There is one more thing, Alistair Finch." Richard's expression hardened. "Consider him handled. The Sterling Whitmore legal team will be reviewing his consultancy contract, and our contacts at the Metropolitan Museum will be receiving a full report of his academic and professional misconduct. His time as a giant is over." Justice, it turned out, could be as swift and decisive as a corporate memo. The meeting concluded not with a formal signing, but with another handshake. This time it was a handshake between three partners, three architects of a new, more thoughtful kind of empire. As they rode the elevator down, Clara felt a sense of dizzying unreality. "Did that just happen?" she murmured, looking at her reflection in the polished steel. Amy smiled. "It did. Welcome to the team, Dr. Dors." "I think," Clara said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that I prefer Clara." When they stepped out into the bright afternoon sun of the lobby, Clara felt the warmth on her face as if for the first time in years. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a ghost. She had a voice, a purpose, and a future she had thought was lost to her forever. She had walked into a restaurant the night before as a waitress, expecting nothing more than sore feet and a few tips. She was walking out as the director of an international cultural foundation, a key player in a global partnership, and the friend of an heiress who had seen her worth when no one else did. It was, she thought, a turn of events more dramatic and unbelievable than any text she had ever studied. 6 months later, the setting was another exclusive restaurant, this one in Tokyo, overlooking the Imperial Palace Gardens from the 45th floor of a glittering skyscraper. The table was large, round, and set for a celebratory dinner. The atmosphere, however, was the polar opposite of that night at Ethelgard. It was warm, vibrant, and filled with respectful conversation. Ami Tanaka-Hayes sat at the head of the table. She looked different. The guarded, fragile poise had been replaced by a relaxed, confident aura. She laughed easily, engaging with the board members from both Tanaka Corporation and Sterling Whitmore, who flanked her. Across from her sat Richard Sterling. He too seemed changed. The cynical armor was still there, but it was less pronounced. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with a newfound consideration. He had even, to the astonishment of his own team, begun taking Japanese language lessons. But the most remarkable transformation was in Clara Doors. She sat to Amy's right, an honored guest and an essential partner. She was in the midst of a spirited debate with Tanaka Corp's lead engineer about how the principles of 14th-century ink wash painting could be applied to virtual reality interfaces. She was animated, brilliant, and completely in her element. Her exhibition, The Soul of the Machine, Kato Tanaka and the Art of Modernity, was set to open in New York in 2 months, and it was already being hailed by critics as a landmark event. Alistair Finch had quietly retired, his reputation in tatters. Halfway through the meal, a young, nervous waiter approached to pour the wine. As he leaned over, his hand trembled slightly, and he splashed a few drops of red wine on the white tablecloth near Clara's plate. He froze, his face draining of color, and began to stammer a frantic apology in Japanese. The table went quiet. For a fleeting second, Clara was back at Ethelgard. The memory of the shattered glass and the suffocating humiliation was still sharp. But this time everything was different. Before the restaurant manager could rush over, Clara simply smiled warmly at the young man. She placed her hand gently over the stain to cover it. Then, speaking in calm, reassuring Japanese, she said, "It is no problem at all. These things happen. Please don't worry." Amy caught her eye from across the table and smiled. Richard Sterling, who understood enough to catch the kindness in her tone, nodded in approval. The moment passed, the conversation resumed, and the young waiter, looking immensely grateful, retreated with his dignity intact. Later that evening, as the dinner wound down, Amy and Clara stepped out onto a private balcony to look at the sprawling galaxy of lights that was Tokyo. The air was cool and crisp. "It's funny," Clara said, gazing at the cityscape. "For so long, a dinner like this was my prison, a place of stress and invisibility. Now," Amy finished for her, "now you have a seat at the table, the one you always deserved." "We both do," Clara corrected gently. "You found your voice that night, Amy. I just gave you the right language to speak it in." Amy looked at the crane and moon pin, which she now wore every day. "My grandfather said, you have to fly between the moon and the reeds. I was stuck, afraid to fly at all. You reminded me that you don't have to fly alone." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. 2 women from impossibly different worlds, bound by an alliance forged in a moment of unexpected grace. They were no longer just an heiress and a waitress. They were partners, friends, and the architects of a future built not on cold calculations, but on the radical, revolutionary idea of truly seeing the person right in front of you. And it had all started with a broken glass, a whispered phrase, and the courage to speak up when nobody else would listen. In the end, this isn't just a story about a business deal. It's about the invisible people who walk among us, holding entire worlds of knowledge, experience, and wisdom that we so often overlook. It's a testament to the fact that true power isn't about the title you hold or the money you command, but about the empathy you show and the courage you have to speak your truth, even when your voice is trembling. Clara was seen as a servant, but she held the key to an empire. Amelia Tanaka Hayes was seen as a figurehead, but she had the strength of a dynasty within her. Have you ever felt invisible in a room where you deserve to be heard? Have you ever witnessed someone being dismissed and wished you could do something? Their story reminds us that one small act of recognition, one moment of connection, can change everything. If the story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Go ahead and hit that button. Share this with anyone you think could use it, and definitely subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about those unsung heroes and surprising turns life throws our way. Thanks a bunch for tuning in. So, if this resonated with you at all, click that share button and send it along to someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for even more true stories. We're talking about the everyday heroes you don't always hear about and the crazy, unexpected twists that life throws at us. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate it.